just like singing. Can't see what for.
The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair, is probably one of the most influential and memorable pieces of watchdog journalism to come from Chicago, if not elsewhere. This infatuating book got important health and safety laws passed and food production plants inspected from sheer influence alone, and astonishingly still remains popular and in print, unlike the overwhelming majority of other bestsellers from the same year. But before I teach you about The Jungle, I first have to tell you about its author.
1, 2, 3.
Sinclair was born in Baltimore in the year of 1878. He had a troubled childhood with an alcoholic father and an extremely strict and, quite frankly, odd mother. Because of his family not being very wealthy, Sinclair would often have to sleep on the couch or on the floor of his parents' bedroom. As a child, Sinclair got to witness firsthand the class struggle within the United States through his wealthy grandparents, whom he would stay with often, thus sparking an interest in socialism within him, which is later reflected in almost all of his writings. Some of the novels he wrote later in his life got so popular as to have film adaptations made for them, with titles including the silent film version of The Jungle, There Will Be Blood, and The Gnome-Mobile. I'm not joking about that last one either. That exists. He married his wife, Maida Fuller, in 1900 and soon had a son named David. Their marriage was rocky, with both of them committing an affair at some point, and also having bad financial struggles, which made them have to live in a dilapidated farmhouse in New Jersey. Prior to 1906, Upton Sinclair hadn't made it big yet and was living with his wife and infant son in poverty, writing for pulp magazines and occasionally creating novels of his own that were both critical and monetary bombs. Didn't get him anywhere, until the miracle year of 1904, when a socialist newspaper by the name of Appeal to Reason commissioned him to write about wage slavery in Chicago. Being a sensible and impoverished writer, Upton Sinclair jumped at the chance of guaranteed monetary gain for what would today be $14,000 and temporarily moved to Chicago, leaving his wife and son behind to fend for themselves. Once Sinclair arrived in Chicago, he convinced some workers in an unspecified plant to smuggle him in and pretend to be a worker. Many of the things he witnessed in the plant he was not at all prepared for. Tubercular and diseased meat getting past inspectors and workers was just the beginning of it. During the summer, the massive swarms of flies would infest the meat with maggots, and the meat would occasionally fall onto the filthy floors covered in dirt, sawdust, and blood, and get rolled around in it. Perhaps the worst part is that during those dark winters, the factories with very little light would be almost all black, and sometimes in these blackened rooms crowded with men with giant sharp knives and axes, well, you might be finding a little more than just pig in your pork chops. Not only was the food handling harrowing, so was the treatment of workers. During this time, there was an influx of immigrants from just about everywhere, but there was specifically an influx of Eastern European immigrants to Chicago. These thousands of individuals came to Chicago in hopes of a better life, but found themselves having severe difficulty finding employment. Many of these people, not being able to speak English and not having much prior experience, had to turn to labor jobs, which many of them still couldn't get into because of them lacking requirements and also xenophobia. The one labor job that many of these immigrants could get despite their handicaps was working in meatpacking plants. Owners of companies like Swift and Armour saw these immigrants as excellent fodder to create a constantly churning, voracious money-making machine. Because these people were yearning for jobs, the companies could pay them less than they would American workers. Thus, these people lived in barely survivable conditions, only getting minor amounts of food and having to either reside in houses crammed with so many other people you'd have to sleep on the floor or sleep on the street. The photographs from Jacob Riis painted a vivid and harrowing image of what life was like for these people. These themes are all reflected in The Jungle, the life of Jurgis and his wife, Ona, living in a filthy house made for only 2 or 3 people, crammed in with several other extended family members. What's also disturbing about the details is that everything Jurgis accounts about the meatpacking plants in the book are actual things that Upton Sinclair experienced firsthand while working in the stockyards. Of course, The Jungle being a novel, it means that the characters, conflicts, and events are all fictional, for the better. Despite it being fictional, things that happened to the characters would all have been possible to real impoverished people back in 1906 and still could happen today. For example, during the book, Jurgis is sent to jail and afterwards cannot get a job because of his criminal record. He also gets a severe ankle injury but still has to go to work in unsanitary conditions, which gets his injury infected. Then later in the novel, his wife is about to give birth, but because they can't afford a doctor or any other kind of health care, she dies during childbirth. Thankfully, we now have safety nets put in place that prevent these things, but that doesn't mean they still can't happen today. There isn't really much to say about the writing of The Jungle. Of course, it's a very well-written book, but the actual writing process itself was not very interesting. It only took about a year for Sinclair to finish writing The Jungle, but it took him from 1904 to 1906 to get it onto the shelves. Why? The reason why it took him so long to get it published was simply because of its controversial subject matter. An alternate version was released in a socialist magazine called Appeal to Reason, sometime in 1905. Besides them, Sinclair couldn't find someone who'd accept to publish a novel as controversial as his. A publisher at Macmillan Publishers even wrote to him saying this:
I advise without hesitation and unreservedly against the publication of this book, which is gloom and horror unrelieved. One feels that what is at the bottom of this fierceness is not nearly so much the desire to help the poor as hatred of the rich.
Sinclair had been rejected so many times that he decided to self-publish a shortened version of The Jungle until Doubleday came along. Doubleday were much more comfortable with publishing The Jungle than others, but still wanted it to be cut down a little, which Sinclair cordially obliged to. Thus, on the last day of February 1906, The Jungle was published. It was almost an instant success, selling 250,000 copies in its first 6 weeks. Unfortunately, despite its success, Sinclair felt that the book's message was misunderstood. Most of the people who read it, despite being given massive hints by the American Socialist Party symbol on the cover and the dedication to the working men of America, didn't realize that the book had heavy socialist undertones and instead focused on the icky food conditions. Which brings me to my next point. The Jungle is almost certainly one of the most influential novels to come from Chicago during the 20th century. While most books that are considered controversial and influential usually just get people talking about something, The Jungle actually caused huge change after it got the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act to be passed soon after its publishing in 1906. Theodore Roosevelt, the man who was also responsible for these laws to be passed, personally disliked Upton Sinclair, so far as to call him a crackpot. The tension between them gradually loosened, and they actually ate lunch together to discuss what Sinclair would think the best way to inspect the meat companies implicated in the scandal would be. He also met FDR, which is unrelated, but it's pretty cool to know that he met both Roosevelts. The money he made from The Jungle also got Sinclair to write more books such as Oil and The Brass Check. Not only did the success of The Jungle allow him to write more books, but it also allowed him to build his dream colony in New Jersey. The Helcon Home Colony was an experimental community created by Upton Sinclair using the money he earned from writing The Jungle. Unfortunately, the colony burnt down in 1907. Although he did not allow black or Jewish people to enter the colony and also ran it in a way that allocated most of the power and control of the community to himself, so perhaps it's rather fortunate that the building self-immolated. I believe that the two most important changes caused by The Jungle were the sudden awareness to the American public of the horrible conditions that the people creating commodities for them had to live in, and also the spreading of socialist and capital-critical ideas, which to some might sound bad, but to me sound pretty epic. I know I've been constantly repeating it, but The Jungle is an extremely important book. It's probably the first book that I've read in a long time that significantly changed my worldview. It made me think critically about the standards and rules most of us have grown to accept. Before reading The Jungle, I had thought of socialism as a wacky idea that could never work, and I thought that capitalism was flawed, but the best choice we had. Tell me, why in the richest country in the world do we have such an opposition to free healthcare? Why do those who don't have yachts full of money have to drown under debt from needs like, say, health complications? Why does everything have to become a product in a capitalist nation like ours? Art, education, music, beauty are all monetized, and people indulge in this. These themes of decadence that our economic structure hold up are propagandized and fetishized through our media. Have you ever noticed how often things like children's books, celebrities, reality TV, advertisements, some form of art promote a severely unhealthy and lavish life of decadence, leisure, and vice? To most people who haven't grown up in a place that's been suffocating under late capitalism, this must sound completely insane. But to the vast majority of people who live here, it just sounds completely average. I don't know how we got here or how we'll get out, but what I do know is that Adam Smith is probably to blame.